Managed to pull it out from underneath the van, and now I can present to you the subframe upon my workbench. The reason why I removed the subframe is I found a couple of cracks within the subframe. Unfortunately, there's one just on the inner area of this arch and the same at the opposite end. So my work is not done here yet. Now, I did get in touch with a few people that I know of in the industry. Mick and John, who both own car restoration companies, I asked them whether or not they do repairs on subframes. They said quite often they do because they're working on cars that's over 40 years old. The only caveat is because they're working on cars that's over 40 years old, sometimes they may not go through an MOT because of the MOT rules. With that information, I did need to find a current MOT examiner. Luckily, I do know one, Sean Miles from Project Camper.
Good morning, everybody. How are you all doing?
I asked him the same question, and he pretty much said what the other two guys said with this piece of information. So thanks to you guys, very much appreciated. So the way about it, from the advice from Mick and John, I completely stripped off the area where those cracks was from paint, inspected it even further. Soon noticed that they had been there for some while due to the corrosion build-up within the cracks. They haven't gone any further over time. I chased out the cracks, infilled those cracks by seam welding it, went over that weld again with some more weld, cleaned off the subframe and painted the subframe up. I did not find any more cracks, it was just them two cracks, so I built up the front subframe. Having the subframe on the workbench is going to make my life a hell of a lot easier in rebuilding it. However, I do have to bear in mind, if I build too much of it, I'm not going to be able to lift it off the workbench and carry it across to the van. So I'm going to build as much as I can to make my life a little bit easier. Now, on the underside of the subframe, which we're looking at in a minute, you'll see some drilled out mounting points for your rubber buffers. The outer hole that's been pre-drilled is for much more of a harsher ride upon your suspension, and as we go inwards, the inner ones are for much more of a softer ride upon your suspension. Mine was originally set on the middle position, and I know for a fact, because I had the heavy duty spring upon my van originally, it was too much of a harsh ride. So I'm going to go for the inner setting to make it much more of a softer ride within the van. So it's just a case locating the pegs within the holes on the underside of the subframe. There you have it. So they're the top buffers mounted. I'm going to turn over the subframe and carry on building the rest. Next stage is to lay my transverse leaf spring within the subframe upon the top mounting buffers, and I have drawn a line right in the middle of this leaf spring so it will match up within the middle bolt holes here. I can now fit the belly plate for the subframe, and you will notice some pre-drilled holes for the mounting points for your rubber buffer, for your bottom rubber buffer, and you want to be matching your bottom rubber buffer to your top rubber buffer. So in my case, it's going to be the inner position. There is another mounting point for another rubber buffer. It's for your rebound rubber buffer, which is a much softer rubber buffer. So we're going to put that in there as well. Make sure that's sat in tightly. Yep. It's just a case of fitting the plate into position. Now I'm going to attach this plate by bolting it from in the middle and working my way out. Well, after nearly an hour and 45 minutes, I now have the sump plate back on the subframe. Definitely not the way to do it the way I did it. It was just too much dicking around. I had to gingerly put each bolt in, working my way outwards and tighten each bolt up. Then I'd slacken all the bolts off that I've put in to get my boomerang plates in, support plates in, because everything was out to kilter, and tighten everything back up again. In the workshop manual it does state to have a jack either end of the transverse leaf spring. Jack up those jacks to take the tension off the sump plate, because when this transverse leaf spring is at rest, it is pushing the plate away from the subframe. So I lift up each end of the transverse leaf spring and then put the plate on. Because I'm doing it in the workshop, I can't do that, and I've done it the way I've done it, not the right way. However, it is back on now, and I can crack on and get some more stuff attached to the subframe. Even though that we are looking at the subframe upside down, I'm going to fit the bottom arm. Even though I'm fitting it up at the top, it can be a bit confusing this because I'm going backwards. So just in case I slide it, the bottom arm, we're in its mounting points. So a screwdriver in there and just get everything lined up. The mounting holes. There we go. Spray some lube in there. Is that going to go in there? No. Just going to get the mounting bolts in first. It's all the way through. That should go all the way through now. We get the nuts on them. Next stage to fit the shocker mount. That goes on top of the bottom arm. Seeing these bolts were rusted in, I'm just going to put a bit of copper slip on them. Just make it a little bit easier to remove if I've got to unbolt this again. There's 4 of these bolts. There we go. And just in case of lining up the shocker mount, the bottom shocker mount onto the bottom arm. There we go. This is the last one. There we go. And as with them, I shall torque up once I get everything else on. Next thing to fit is the shock absorber. I have primed that already. Just grab my nuts for my bolts. 24mm headed nut. I can put the bottom bolt in for the shock absorber. There we have it. Yet again, 21mm headed bolt and 24mm headed nuts. Okay, so tighten these up as well. I don't keep slipping off it. And because it's not heavy enough, I thought I'd fit the steering rack as well. I think that's about as far I'm going to go with it. If I put anything else on there, I'm not going to be able to carry it. Just don't do this at home, kids. Let Uncle Dickhead do this. Stop that. Whoa! Oh well, see you now. Yeah, I resorted to mechanical lifting. Right, let's get underneath the van. I managed to coax the subframe underneath the van and get it on top of the jack. So it's just a case now of me lifting the subframe into position. Right, are we at a position I can line up them holes? Can't see him yet. Okay, now I've got the bolts all tightened up and the subframe is now attached and fixed firmly onto the chassis of the van. Remember, I put the shock absorber on, the shock absorber mounting plate, the leaf spring that's inside the subframe, and the bottom arms were all attached whilst I was in the workshop. So there isn't much left to put back on here. First job is to get the top arm in. Just draw it in a bit more. Can I get a screwdriver in there? Yep. There we go. Should be able to get some bolts in there now. Bit of persuasion. There goes the other bolt. Put nuts on both ends of the bolts. Same on the other side. Let's get the nuts started. Now before I go any further, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to spray along in here some wax oil, because they do have a prone to corroding up in here and cracking along these edges on the arm. So just to protect it, I'm going to spray some wax oil in there. There we go. Now before I just put that top arm back onto its hub, I'm just going to tighten up the brake pipe here back on its mounting bracket, because it'd be just a little bit easier. There we have it. Right, I can draw this down now and locate it in top of the hub. Bring that bolt out a bit. Just coax it in a bit. There we have it. Next stage, I'm going to tighten these bolts up with the top arm. 21mm headed bolts, 24mm headed nut. There we go, that's tight. At the bottom of the ball joint there is a 8mm Allen key insert to stop the full ball joint from spinning around like that. Just put the 9 key in there, just keep hold of it. And it will stop spinning round. There we have it. The top arm ball joint that goes onto the hub is now secure. On this side, I've already inserted the chock rod end for the steering. It's just a case of tightening that up. I believe that was a 22mm headed nut, which it is. The only other job I've got left to do is the mounting bracket for the brake pipes. That's just a 10mm headed bolt with a 10mm headed nut. Other than that, the suspension is now back together. The last jobs to do was to reconnect the steering column back onto the steering rack, and the power steering hoses were connected onto the steering rack as well. I've topped up the power steering fluid as well. I then fitted the wheels and moved the van here because I want to measure something. As mine was set on the middle section, I did measure it beforehand, and it was 820mm from the floor to the top of the wheel arch. And I can confirm 820mm wide height. No difference. Brakes next.